Well, this is Dateline News and Conversation. I'm not going to waste any time tonight getting started because my guest is somebody that all of you know by now, Peter Cuznick. Peter, welcome back to the show.
Hi, Regis.
Well, tonight I'd like to talk with you about a number of things. You were recently up in New York
Yeah.
for the Nuclear Proliferation Conference. You participated in that. You had an interview with Annie Jacobson, uh, probably one of the leading anti nuclear activists in the United States and the world right now. We have to talk about the end of the hegemon, the end of the United States empire. And we got to talk about Russia, China, and Iran. And Peter, everybody now is looking forward to Trump's 2 day visit to Beijing on Thursday of this week. And then a little bit later this month in May, Putin is going to Beijing. You got to wonder what's going on. Are there going to be deals? No deals? And then finally, if we have time, Victory Day celebrations, not only in Russia, but all across the world. Peter, let's start. You went up to New York over the weekend for this non proliferation conference. Share with our audience what that was all about and the interview you had with Annie Jacobson.
Well, Regis, it was not actually an interview I had with Annie Jacobson. Annie and Ivana Hughes, the president of the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation, who teaches at Columbia, and I did a side session at the NPT, in which we talked about nuclear threats, nuclear proliferation, nuclear treaties, especially treaties between the United States, the Soviet Union, and Russia over the years, and how countries that don't really trust each other can actually put in verification procedures that can have treaties that not only limit the number of nuclear weapons, but actually reduce the number of nuclear weapons. As some of your audience knows, back in 1986, we had 70,000 nuclear weapons in the world. Now we're down to a little more than 12,000. We made some significant progress, but 12,000, as Annie and Ivana and I stressed, are still enough to cause a nuclear winter that could end most of life on the planet, if not potentially all life on the planet. So the Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conference takes place every 5 years, and the last two review conferences could not come up with an agreement at the end. They cannot find language that everybody could sign off on. I'm not very optimistic about this one either. One of the key provisions of the original NPT, which was passed in 1968 and signed into effect in 1970, Article 6 said that all what it did is establish 5 nuclear powers, and then everybody else signed on saying that they would not become nuclear powers, and they would submit to rigid inspections by the IAEA to make sure they weren't becoming nuclear powers, nuclear weapon states. But the 5 original ones had to work toward eliminating their nuclear arsenals. Well, that was 1970. It's now 56 years later, and we still haven't gotten rid of those nuclear arsenals. But that was the deal with the non-nuclear nuclear weapon states. However, 3 countries didn't join the NPT: Israel, Pakistan, and India. And a 4th one, North Korea, did join, but then withdrew. So there are now 9 nuclear weapon states, 5 of which are acknowledged in the original NPT, 4 more that have since added, although Israel does not acknowledge having nuclear weapons, even though we know that Israel has somewhere between 90 and 300 nuclear weapons, and the U.S. goes along with this facade. So technically, the U.S. would have to stop giving aid to Israel. And now, at least 30 members of the Congress, Democrats in Congress, I think almost all, if not all, have called for the United States acknowledging that Israel is a nuclear weapon state. But the deal in the Middle East and Southwest Asia is that if Israel acknowledges its nuclear weapons, then the other countries in the region will also develop their own nuclear weapons. So all this big brouhaha over Iran's supposed nuclear weapons program, which there's no evidence to support that they were really trying to build a nuclear weapon, is part of this whole mess, confusion, lies, sanitized lies that have been going on in this world of bizarre and deceitful diplomacy.
Peter, thanks for that update. As you know, I've been very concerned about the threat of nuclear war. And I made that film of mine in 2016, 30 Seconds to Midnight, in which I interviewed Dr. Helen Caldicott. She's now living back in Australia. Was probably the leading anti-nuclear activist in the country. She was on all the television shows, radio shows, speaking engagements all over the country. And I have since been in contact with her. And she believes now that the danger now is greater than it's ever been before. And, you mentioned Israel, Pakistan, India, and North Korea. The talk now among non-nuclear countries is that they need to follow the lead, like of North Korea, to gain a nuclear capability as a deterrent. And Peter, this is madness. It's not just madness and insanity. It's kind of an evil curse upon humanity.
Exactly.
And, the problem that I see is that the peace groups, and I'll only focus on the United States today, and the nuclear activist groups are not united. They're working in silos, and because of that, they basically have been stripped of all power and influence, so that the powers that be, the people in government, just take no heed to what's going on. And I think that's very dangerous. Peter, I want your comments now, because you have been following what's going on in Iran, and you've been following for many years now what's going on in Ukraine. The threat of nuclear war, not just by a miscalculation, Peter, but because of the desperation that Israel might feel if it believes that its existence is at stake. And Vladimir Zelensky in Ukraine is saying he needs a nuclear weapon. Peter, what are your thoughts on these two countries having the possibility of having nuclear weapons, being threatened, and then using them? Peter, I think it's very frightening.
Regis, there's so much in what you said there. Let's unpack as much as we can. You started off by talking about Helen Caldicott. Helen has been a leading anti-nuclear crusader for decades now. I think it was Helen who said that when she watched the movie On the Beach back in 1959, that set off a spark, made her realize how dangerous it is. Because if you recall On the Beach, great ominous movie, There's a nuclear war in the northern hemisphere, and then all the fallout starts spreading around the planet. And the last pocket of survivors is in Melbourne, Australia. And Helen, being from Australia, took that very, very personally. It was a great, powerful movie. And you see the question is, how did we do this to ourselves as a species? And the leading scientist, Julian, is played by Fred Astaire, the great song and dance man from 30s movies with Ginger Rogers. But he's a serious scientist in this movie. And they're on the submarine that's commanded by Gregory Peck. And the members there ask him, how did this start? And he has a great critique of deterrence theory. He said, all began when we decided to defend ourselves with weapons that nobody could use without triggering an all-out nuclear war that would end all life on the planet effectively. And then he goes into more detail. But Helen really gets it. And I think it was back in the 1980s when she did a documentary called If You Love This Planet. And I remember how much I was moved by that, along with The Fate of the Earth by Jonathan Schell, and even movies like The Day After and Testament and Threads. And there was such a powerful anti-nuclear mindset at the time that even Ronald Reagan had a change of heart, which he attributed to watching the movie The Day After. And then when Gorbachev came to power in 1985, after 3 elderly Soviet leaders had died within a year and a half or so, then young, vigorous, visionary Mikhail Gorbachev comes to power, and he reaches out to Reagan, and they have a meeting in Geneva that's very successful, and they have a meeting the next year in Reykjavik in Iceland, in which they came within one word of eliminating offensive nuclear weapons. If Reagan had agreed to keep Star Wars testing inside the laboratory for the next decade, then the Russians and Gorbachev were going to sign off on this deal that Nitsa and others said was the best deal the Americans had ever seen. But Reagan, not knowing what to do as usual, turned to Richard Pearl. And Richard Pearl, the Prince of Darkness, said that you shouldn't do it because if you do, it's going to mean the end of your Star Wars fantasy. So over the fact that the United States was not willing to limit Star Wars to the laboratory, even though it had barely even entered the laboratory at the time, that's how close we came to eliminating nuclear weapons. The booby prize was the INF Treaty, which was better than nothing, but compared to what almost happened at Reykjavik in 1986, and that was Gorbachev's work. Gorbachev was the visionary. He wanted a world without nuclear weapons, but unfortunately, it didn't happen. And then we still haven't eliminated nuclear weapons, and we still have enough to cause nuclear winter, which would be a disaster. But the point you were making is that a lot of people now think that the only way to protect yourself from being bombed by the US and Israel, or have your leaders kidnapped, or starting a war against you, is if you've got nuclear weapons, if you've got a nuclear deterrent. And so which is the point that North Korea, I guess it might have been Kim Jong-il, made in 2003, when the United States, might have been Kim Jong-un already, when the United States invaded Iraq. He said the one mistake Saddam Hussein made was not to have nuclear weapons, because if they had, then the US could not have invaded. So that's a lesson we learned from the Cuban Missile Crisis, by default, in a sense. But it's a lesson we've learned over the years, that if you have nuclear weapons, you're protected. If you don't, you're vulnerable. And that's part of the lesson that Netanyahu and Trump assume that the Iranians have learned. Why do they accuse Iran of having a nuclear weapons program when there's no evidence at all to support that? They do because they said, if I were the leader of Iran, after we'd been attacked twice by Israel and the United States within 8 months or so, then I would develop a nuclear weapon as protection against me and against Netanyahu. That's the way Trump reasons, even though the Ayatollah Ali Khamenei had a fatwa against nuclear weapons, even though the United States CIA said Iran gave up any pretense of a nuclear weapons program back in 2003, even though under the JCPOA, Iran shipped out 98% of its enriched uranium, mothballed most of its centrifuges, was enriching up to 3.67%, and was subjected to the most intensive investigation by the IAEA ever. Spot investigations anytime. They can go to any site without a minute warning, and they've said that they were totally clean. But what did Trump do? The idiot, he tore it up, and partly because it was negotiated by Obama, even though it was working brilliantly. And Iran was more than a year away from a nuclear weapon. When the U.S. tore it up, the Iranians responded by enriching not the 3.67%, but up to 60%, which is enough for some very primitive Hiroshima-style nuclear weapons. And there's a lot of discussion that Trump's been insisting that Iran get rid of its enriched uranium, up to 60%. However, he's ignoring the fact that Iran has thousands and thousands of pounds of lower enriched uranium and also of plutonium. And so, this is not something that we're going to be able to eliminate by bombing them, by trying to destroy them, even by so-called regime change. And we need regime change. We need regime change in Washington. We need regime change in Tel Aviv. We definitely need some of these regimes to be toppled and to be replaced by much saner, more peaceful kinds of leadership. But, and if the Iranian people want to change their government, more power to them. I'm all in support of that as well. I'm not a fan of theocracies, and certainly not ones that are as repressive as the Iranian government. But in this situation, it's not Iran that's the provocateur. It's not Iran that's the aggressor. It's Israel and the United States. But you mentioned this threat of proliferation. Yeah, Zelensky said either let us into NATO or let us have our own nuclear weapons. We got the same thing from Naraki. The president of Poland says Poland needs its own nuclear weapons. The South Koreans, 73% of the South Koreans say they want their country to have its own nuclear weapons. There are a lot of forces in Japan now that are pushing for Japan to become a quote unquote normal nation, which means having its own aggressive military and nuclear arsenal. And we know that Japan's got massive stockpiles of plutonium. We've been saying for years that they're one screwdriver twist away from nuclear weapons. And so, but there are a lot of other countries. You've got the idiots in Paris wanting to extend the nuclear umbrella over Germany and other countries in Europe. So we've got the world going the wrong direction. The point you were making, instead of eliminating nuclear weapons, we're saying that nuclear weapons are so important that the United States and the 8 other nuclear powers refuse to give them up, are actually modernizing their nuclear arsenals, making them more efficient, more lethal, and now we're expanding them as well. So we are really, we are really going not only the wrong direction, but the suicidal instinct that we seem to have as a species seems to be taking precedence over our ability to love and resolve things diplomatically and peacefully and look for answers that are in everybody's interest, not just the United States' interest or Israel's interest, or for that matter, Iran's interest. This kind of hyper-nationalism in which Putin wants to make Russia great again. Xi wants to make China great again. Modi wants to make India great again. Trump wants to make America great again. You go down the line, you got all these nationalists rather than people who speak for the planet or can even think in that way. We see some glimmers of that coming out of Xi Jinping. At least his rhetoric is along those lines. Lula in Brazil, the Pope Leo, Guterres at the United Nations, but we need to be able to rethink our relations and rethink our stance toward the universe and begin to see ourselves as one planetary population. I'm not a big fan of Jimmy Carter, but he did one thing or a few things I like. And one of them is he asked Carl Sagan, the brilliant astronomer, astrophysicist, to write him a paragraph that he could include in his farewell address in 1981. And Sagan said, that same technology that could launch nuclear weapons also projects us out into space. And from outer space, we look back at this fragile blue planet that we all share, and you don't see any divisions of race. You don't see any divisions of geography. You don't see any divisions of ethnicity. You don't see any divisions of religion. We're one small, tiny globe floating out there all alone. And we should be thinking in those global terms. Unfortunately, that's not what's happening right now.
Wow, Peter, I don't have anything to add to that, but I do want to make a couple of comments. Carl Sagan's advice to Carter was incredibly moving. I have often thought of that. As you mentioned, if you look at it from outer space, it's tiny blue marble, this tiny blue planet against the darkness of the rest of the universe. No borders, no color, no political divisions, nothing. And I've always hoped and prayed that we could recognize who we are as one species, united with each other, with all life on the planet, and with the rest of the universe. Unfortunately, that's going to take a giant leap. The other thing that I wanted to say, Peter, was Dr. Helen Caldicott has become a dear friend. She said at the end of my film, looking at the potential danger of the extinction of humanity, she said this, and I quote, "Are we an evolutionary aberration designed in an evolutionary sense not to survive?" She ended with, "I wonder." And Peter, you've got to wonder. Over the centuries, the millennia that we have evolved as a species, we now have possession of the weapon that can end humanity and all life on the planet. It's truly terrifying. And I really appreciate everything that you've said to underscore the urgency of getting rid of all nuclear weapons. I followed very closely the talks in Reykjavik, Iceland, between Reagan and Gorbachev. When Gorbachev said, "I have a new proposal for you." This was at the end of these meetings. He said, "Let's get rid of all nuclear weapons." And it's reported that Reagan liked the boldness of the idea, but he told the American people, "I just cannot give up Star Wars."
Yeah.
As we look at this so many years later, Star Wars was a fantasy. The Israeli Iron Dome has now been revealed as a myth. It's been penetrated. And with all the new technology that certainly Russia has developed with hypersonic missiles of all kinds, the danger for humanity is staring us right in the face. It's like a freight train moving high speed, coming at us
Yeah.
with no ability to stop it. Peter, I really thank you for that.
Regis, I agree with you so much, but we look at this situation now that we're in. The the Israelis and the Gulf states and the U.S. in the region have been shooting down these $30,000 drones that Iran's been launching, often with interceptors that cost upwards of $1 million. Some of them, the THAAD interceptors, can cost up to $10 million. What is the logic behind shooting down a $35,000 drone with an interceptor that costs upwards of $1 million? It doesn't work. And we know that Israel's got 3 different layers of its defensive system, but the one that shoots down the most threatening incoming missiles are the Arrow 2 and Arrow 3 interceptors. And Israel started off with somewhere in the vicinity of 150 when the war began, and now they're down to single digits, the best we can tell. And Washington Post had some interesting articles last week, one of which said that Iran's attacks in the region and in Israel and the U.S. bases and the Gulf states are so much more effective than anybody's been letting on. They've been destroying and hitting these targets. But if you think of it, Iran already has 2 nuclear weapons. One is the Strait of Hormuz. Controlling that is more powerful than a nuclear weapon. And the second is Iran's ability to hit the Israeli nuclear facility at Dimona. Because even if Israel's able to shoot down, say, 93% of the incoming missiles, that means that 7% get through. The Iranians, now the U.S. intelligence says Iran still has 70% of its missiles, 75% of its launchers, and more than 50% of its drones. So if they shoot them off in swarms, a lot of them are going to get through. Some of them could pierce the containment facility over the Dimona nuclear plant, and that would mean that large parts of Israel would become uninhabitable, certainly for decades, probably for hundreds of years, possibly for thousands of years. And then the same thing, the U.S. and Israel have been hitting the Bushehr nuclear plant in Iran. If they pierce the dome there, the containment facility, then large parts of not only Iran, but other Gulf states become uninhabitable for the foreseeable future. We play this insane game of chicken, as you said, based on the assumption that nobody's crazy enough or reckless enough to do exactly what they're already doing. It's not as if it's some far-fetched kind of thing. We're so close to that already, and people just don't appreciate how close we are. And it's terrifying. Those of us who care about the future, as Kennedy said when he signed the Partial Space Ban Treaty, the first nuclear weapons treaty in 1963, he said, this is for all of us, but it's especially for our children and grandchildren. He said, and they have no lobby here in Washington. So, we're wiping out the future. The point that Jonathan Schell made so brilliantly in Fate of the Earth, we not only wipe out the past, but we wipe out the future if we have this kind of global nuclear war. All the generations that won't be born.
Peter, you mentioned that Iran had a nuclear weapon. The chokehold on the entire global economy in the Straits of Hormuz.
Yeah.
Peter, not enough people are talking about this. People around the world and in the United States are beginning to feel the effects of it. But the tsunami has not yet hit, especially in the United States, although people are experiencing the rising costs of gas, fuel. Once it affects diesel, and it's very close to that, United States, forget the rest of the world for now. You and I talk about our country, the United States, is going to face a disastrous collapse because Americans will not only not be able to get the basic necessities for life, food, etc. This will bring about an economic collapse that hasn't been seen since before the Great Depression. I think if this is not resolved and resolved quickly, Peter, all of humanity is facing dire consequences. And Peter, I have to think back, and you're an expert on this. The United States imposed an oil embargo on Japan in 1941, forcing the Japanese to attack Pearl Harbor. I'm wondering if this oil embargo and Trump's blocking of the straits, which is, in my way of thinking, not only insane but comical, will it cause some country facing the unthinkable to respond in an unthinkable way? And those countries that do have the capability of nuclear weapons, will they use it? Peter, your thoughts?
Even Hughes of Columbia and the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation and I have become columnists for Al Jazeera. And the first column we authored together was called Breaking the Nuclear Taboo. And that was maybe 2 months ago, or at least more than a month ago. And we said there that we feared that Donald Trump, who's broken every custom, every norm, every tradition, broken international law, broken US law, there's one taboo that he hasn't broken yet, and that's the nuclear taboo. And we know there are people whispering in his ear who tell him, just like Netanyahu told him, you're going to go down as the greatest president in American history because they've all been anti-Iran, but you're the first one with the guts to actually go to war with Iran. This is going to make you the greatest American president ever. We know that that influenced Trump into helping launch this invasion, this bombing. And we know that there are people whispering in his ear the same thing about nuclear weapons, using nuclear weapons. And so when J.D. Vance, the supposed peacenik in the administration, says that the U.S. still has weapons in its toolkit, which it has tools in its toolkit, which it hasn't used, he's talking about nuclear weapons. We know when Trump says we're going to wipe out a civilization in the next 24 hours, he's talking about using nuclear weapons. So we know that there are nuclear planners in the United States who are trying to convince Trump that a nuclear war can be fought and won. The Bulletin of Atomic Scientists has had 3 articles talking about these lunatics, people who think that the United States has the technological capability to launch a preemptive nuclear strike against Russia, China, and North Korea, to which they would not be able to retaliate if we hit them first. And so, yeah, I'm terrified about the use of nuclear weapons. The Israelis have a lot of them. They've got fewer constraints. If they think it's any kind of existential threat now or in the future, they could preemptively use nuclear weapons. Trump could do that. The people around him, Miller, Hegseth, these extreme right-wing militarists who say that might makes right. Hegseth, who brags, we negotiate with bombs. You know, these people are very dangerous, and there's nobody standing between Trump and the use of nuclear weapons. That's the reality in the United States. Trump gives the order to use them unless somebody's willing to defy that order, which is almost certainly not going to happen. Then the planet is on then the life expectancy of our species is going to be greatly diminished.
And Peter, I know that you follow the news about Russia. In the last week, Sergei Karamanov, one of the leading hardliners who is close to Putin, who represents the views of the hardliners in Russia, came out last week publicly in an article and basically said that Russia can win a nuclear war against the EU. And that if Russia doesn't strike now, we're going to see a repeat of the militarization in Germany and a repeat of 1941 in World War II. 2 days later, Peter, Dmitry Medvedev, the former president of Russia, and now a deputy in the Russian Security Council, has been coming out for weeks as a hawk,
Yeah.
as a hardliner. And he wrote an extensive article with footnotes detailing the history of Europe and the West against Russia. And he too is advocating for Russia to do something significant to the European Union, to London, to Paris, to Brussels, even Finland and Sweden, who are so anti-Russian and militaristic. He's saying if we don't do it now, it's going to be too late. Both of these people. Peter, when the people in Europe are talking about needing, as we talked about, to get nuclear weapons, when Russia, already known, has an incredible arsenal not only of nuclear weapons, but of hypersonic missiles that have the ability to do to all of Europe, any place in Europe, what happened in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Peter, when you and I talk about being horrified, terrified, and frightened, the hyperbole, the language that's coming out of Europe and what's coming out of hardliners in Russia scares the bejesus out of me. And I have to say this, Peter, it's a Latin expression. Si vis bellum, para bellum. If you want war, prepare for war. And this is what I see happening right here in Europe and Eurasia. Peter, I don't know how I can minimize that any further.
No. I mean, I know a friend of mine met with Putin a few months ago and came away saying that Putin feels very much in the middle between the doves, the anti-war forces around him, and the Russian hardliners to his right. The hardliners and the nationalists want him to escalate dramatically along the lines that you're suggesting. And Putin feels that he's a brake against their extremism. So even though in the West he's demonized, people who understand Russia, as you do, know that he's actually caught in the middle and sees himself as a force of sanity against the Russians who want to use nuclear weapons and other more extreme measures. And that's frightening to me. In the United States, we don't have that luxury because Trump is in bed with the extremists 95% of the time and certainly kowtows to them. It's a very, very dangerous situation. The U.S. abrogated the ABM Treaty in 2002. At that point, Russia began developing new weapon systems, or at least delivery systems. And on March 1st, 2018, Putin announced that Russia has now developed 5 new nuclear weapons delivery systems, all of which can circumvent U.S. missile defense. So Russia's been working on that for more than 20 years. And now we've seen the Oreshnik. We've seen the Burevestnik. We've seen the Poseidon. There are others on the way. And what they've said is that they can indeed hit anywhere in the United States, anywhere else, and they can't stop these attacks. And so we know also that the Europeans are insanely hawkish, even though Merz correctly said that Iran is humiliating the United States. He can sound a little bit reasonable when it comes to Southwest Asia. He's not at all reasonable when it comes to Russia. And so, even though some of the Europeans are hedging their bets and going to China and meeting with Xi Jinping, and some of them are talking about developing friendlier relations with Russia, the line coming out of Europe is still that Putin is an aggressive threat to peace, that if Putin succeeds in any kind of victory in Ukraine, then he's coming after Europe next. That's what the Rutte, the head of NATO, says. After Ukraine, Europe. That's what all the European leaders, the main ones, Merz, Macron, Starmer, all keep saying over and over again. As Merz says, this is like the Sudetenland in 1938. Hitler wanted Sudetenland. He didn't want to stop there. That's the way Putin is also. You've got France's leading general, France's highest military officer, General Fabien Mandon, telling the French governors, the problem with you guys is you don't want to see France lose its children. But France better get ready to lose its children in order to stop Russia. We've got Blaise Metruel, the head of intelligence in England. We've got all these leaders saying one after another, as Tusk says in Poland, either money, dollars today or blood tomorrow. So we've got to stand up now to Russia, and whatever that takes. And then you've got the hawks in Russia seeing all this vast remilitarization going on in Europe, where they're going from 2% of GDP spent on their militaries to 5%, or in some cases more than 5% of GDP spent on the militaries. And the people in Russia say they're preparing for war, and we've got to prepare for war too. Everybody's got to take a breath and step back. I see this vast militarization, all this money being wasted. Trump said it about the US. So we've got to cut the social programs in order to rebuild our military. The same thing happening across Europe, cutting the school program, the education funding, the housing funding, the food programs. It means cutting the things that give European life meaning and make it rich and meaningful, really, are being cut in order to build up their militaries. And I don't hear any of them really, except maybe for Fico or a couple others in Europe, talking reasonably about why don't we look for peaceful off-ramps? Why don't we try diplomacy rather than war fighting and militarization? And that would be in Russia's best interest too. I love the condemnation coming out of Putin and Lavrov and Peskov and Ryabkov and others of the US-Israeli war with Italy. But they've got no moral authority as long as the invasion of Ukraine grinds on. But you think of the craziness of this thinking that Russia, which is now in its 5th year against Ukraine and still hasn't been able to take the entirety of the Donbass, that this same Russia is going to want to go to war with NATO? I mean, this is lunacy. But that's what these people, and they scaremonger the European populations into willingness to give up their social programs to fund their militaries because they're afraid of what Putin's going to do after he gets a win in Ukraine. We need an off-ramp now. And I'd love to hear Putin make that speech, say, we're winning in Ukraine. Eventually, we're going to take the rest that we want and fulfill our goals. But instead, we know this is not a time for war. We see what's happening around the planet. And we're going to show the leadership that we represent a higher view of civilization. And we're going to call off this war, even though we're still making progress on the battlefield. That would be so much in Russia's interest. And it would be so much in the world's interest at this point. Because then Russia and China can work along with India and the global South and the African Union and the others and say we need a different direction right now. And that's what I would like to see.
Peter, the only thing I could add to that, having lived in Russia now for over 6 years, almost 7 years actually, um, humanity, the entire globe, owes a debt of gratitude to President Putin for exercising restraint when so many of Russia's red lines have been crossed, and he could have acted
Yeah.
with all of that unbelievable military force under his control. He hasn't done it. And we can be thankful for that, for his prudence, for his wisdom, and for his patience. Um,
Yeah,
Peter,
I agree with you totally. And you look at the lies that about the Ukraine war. First of all, that the U.S. says all the time it was an unprovoked invasion. Unprovoked? I mean, NATO expanded to Russia's doorstep. It was so provoked that all the American diplomats had been warning for years, for decades in most cases, that this is going to provoke Russia into a war. Secondly, the idea this is a full scale invasion, which they say over and over again. It's not a full scale invasion. Russia could do so much more. You look what Israel is doing in Gaza. Russia never did that in Ukraine. There have been some excesses, yes, and some killing of civilians, yes, but they haven't targeted civilians, or else they could have done so much more damage than they've done. The next idea, that's a lie, is that if Putin gets a win in Ukraine, then he's going to gobble up one piece of Europe after another. And that's not true either, or that even think about doing that. This is not who Russia is, and it's not even who Putin is. But he's so demonized in the West. This Russophobic attitude is so pervasive at this point that nobody's thinking rationally and looking for alternatives. Somehow, Russia has become the new version of Nazi Germany, and they're going to march on and conquer the world. That is not what Russia is about. That is not what Ukraine is about. And that is not what the dynamic between Russia and Europe now is about. But to listen to the European leaders, you think that that's what's at stake.
Peter, you and I both know since Vladimir Putin came to power in the year 2000, 26 years ago, he has repeatedly asked to become part of NATO, to become part of Eurasia, Europe, and Asia, which Russia is the bridge between the two. It's part Asia, it's part Europe. He has been denied on every single occasion to do that by the United States. It is Putin who has offered always uh, the olive branch, the dove of peace, to uh, become, he calls them our partners in the West. You got to love his choice of words. He never says our enemies. Now, maybe he's saying our adversaries, but it's always been our partners. And, Peter, you and I, in our own ways, have spent a lifetime trying to dispel the lies, the Russophobia about all things Russian and everything about President Putin being another Hitler. He's anything but that. And, I can only hope, Peter, that the conversation you and I are having today will reach a few more people and will wake them up, namely, and we had a little glitch there. but I was saying that without Putin and without Russia, humanity would be facing extinction. Now, Peter,
Without,
with the,
without the Soviet Union and World War II, we would have faced extinction. We
yeah,
just commemorated Victory Day. And I went to the event at the Russian embassy last week, and there were a lot of some World War II veterans there, American World War II veterans, including at least one person who was there at the Elbe River when the U.S. and the Soviet forces met there and celebrated together and drank together and partied together. And we forget that lesson. We forget the lessons of World War II. When we were friends, we fought against fascism together. And now we see the fascism on the rise. We see the U.S. threatening its friends and allies. We see the U.S. isolated, with these extreme right wingers in power, as we see in much of the world right now. And, it's very, very sad that we don't share and embrace the positive things in our history together. But the United States is the most egregious in that regard. Uh, at least when I go to Russia, there's a strong sense of history and pride. In the United States, Americans remember nothing. Joe and Lai once said, "That's the charming thing about Americans; they have absolutely no historical memory." And he meant it ironically, of course. There's nothing charming about it. But the U.S. philosopher George Santayana said, "A country without historical memory is a country of madmen," and that's what I see my country representing now, of a belligerent force where we go in and kidnap leaders of other countries, where we start reckless wars, illegal, immoral, and insane, and we threaten Greenland, and we threaten, we threaten Colombia, we threaten Mexico, we threaten Canada, we threaten Nigeria, Panama. I mean, what kind of world are we living in right now? We might not have this world for much longer, as much as we try to interject some sanity into what's going on.
Peter, I don't know that I can end on a note of hope, except for one thing, and that's this: that Russia and China have exercised extreme restraint in the face of this crumbling hegemon, the United States. They have agreed to keep talking. We mentioned earlier Trump is going to Beijing on Thursday of this week for 2 days. I think he was hoping to go there to be able to force China and President Xi into some bargain that would favor the United States. I personally don't think that's going to happen. Putin is going to go there in a couple of weeks. And I have to wonder, given what Trump is trying to do to both of these countries, they're both targets, obviously stated publicly, enemies of the United States. And now both countries heavily invested in Iran and what America and Israel are doing to the country of Iran. Peter, what are your thoughts before we finish on what you think is really going on at this really higher level of geopolitical activity?
I think that the United States is a wounded beast right now. The United States is not only losing in this war with Iran, but the U.S. is trapped in a position where now Trump doesn't really care about other Republicans, but the Republican Party, which really Trump still controls, is desperate Trump's approval ratings are in the toilet and going down and down. The support for the war goes down. Gas prices in the US are up more than 50%. Diesel prices, which you mentioned before, in many cases are up 80%. American people are hurting, they're disgusted, they're angry, and they're taking it out on the Republicans. The latest polling shows the Democrats up 10% in the midterm elections. 52% of the people say they're going to vote for the Democrats, 42% say they're going to vote for the Republicans. So what you're seeing is a vast reversal from 2024 to 2026. That makes Trump desperate. So Trump is now looking for a way out. And so when the US takes military action against Iran, Trump dismisses it as a love tap. And Trump says the Iranian attacks on US ships in the region, are no escalation, hasn't changed the thing. Trump is desperate for a way out. But the Iranians have the US by the short hairs, and they're not letting go right now because they know they have the cards. And they know that the US and Israel have attacked them illegally, immorally, causing vast damage twice within 8 months. And so this latest Iranian proposal, which the US has now rejected, talks about the US paying reparations, the US opening up its blockade of the Gulf, the US lifting the sanctions against Iran, unfreezing the money. They're not going to even bother talking about the nuclear stuff till later. Nobody wants to see Iran have a nuclear weapon. No reasonable person does. I certainly don't, and I'm sure you don't want to see Iran have nuclear weapons. The last thing we need is for Iran to have a nuclear weapon. Then the Saudis, the Emiratis, the Egyptians, the Turks, and others will all develop their own nuclear arsenals. That would create an even more dangerous situation. What we need is to have a nuclear weapons-free zone throughout the Middle East. We need to integrate Israel in a peaceful way and use that Israeli technology to help develop desalination plants, turn the deserts green throughout the Middle East, live together in harmony without nuclear weapons that nobody needs there, including Iran, and especially not Israel. And what we need then is peaceful off-ramps. So before even Trump went to Beijing, we saw Araghchi, the Iranian foreign minister, in Beijing last week, and calling the Saudis and the Emiratis from Beijing. We see Putin, Xi Jinping being an international diplomat, welcoming European leaders, welcoming Asian leaders, and talking about the need for a peaceful resolution. China's affected by this in a big way. They prepared in advance, but they're definitely affected. All the world economy is affected, as you say before, and threatened with collapse. The Africans get 80% or more of their fertilizer from the Gulf. They desperately need that. A 10% reduction in fertilizer use by African farmers is going to mean a 25% reduction in rice production, in wheat, and other absolutely essential things that the Africans need, or else we're going to see massive starvation soon in Africa. So, this is the world we're creating. The stupidity of the US and Israel going to war with Iran, when any intelligent person knew that the Iranians were going to use the Strait of Hormuz as a chokehold. So we've been warning about this, and this is what we've created. So we need to force the US and Israel to stop this fighting in Lebanon, in Iran, in Yemen, throughout the region, and instead opt for for diplomacy and for ending this war diplomatically immediately, because it's going to still take months and months and months before prices return, before the oil supply is sparked, before the fertilizer gets shipped and used. We're just seeing the loss of capacity for us as a planetary civilization.
Oh, Peter, it's depressing to think of all of this, but Peter, I think it's absolutely important to be so bold, stark, and revealing to try to wake up people from their slumber, to shock them out of apathy.
To try to shake
And,
us out of apathy.
yeah. And Peter, I can't thank you enough. And, given what is happening now in the next few weeks, with whether Trump is going to do something crazy in Iran, whether Israel will do something crazy in Iran, and what is going to happen with these high-level talks, as we've been talking about, between President Trump and President Putin in Beijing. Peter, we got to stay in touch. We got to do this again.
Regis, anytime. I'm always make time for you.